Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Jeff, and we are now at episode 6 of the Basic series. Now, unfortunately, this concept is a little bit more advanced than Basics. However, it has been asked so many times, I think I need to just do a video on it. So, we're going through the fatigue end game state, and what that means is basically how you navigate throughout the game on not getting yourself fatigued. Because, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, who think that Riptide is just incredibly easy to fatigue, the typical warrior players being like, here's 3 card block and then send weapon with 1 card, and boom, you never run out of cards, you should be able to fatigue them. That's not how that works. A good Riptide player will understand how to keep the density in their deck high and how to navigate around it and extract value out of their deck. So we're going to go over that. This is definitely going to be a video that you're going to have to rewatch. So what I recommend is taking a couple concepts at a time, applying it, executing it, learning it, and then coming back, doing it again, looking over again, figuring out everything that you need to about how to navigate through those states. Because at the end of the day, this is a concept that it's not easy to learn. It's something that you just get after so many games and after so many reps. So this is something that you're just going to have to try, practice, and understand eventually. But we're going to move on. One of the things you got to consider is that at the end of the day, it depends on your matchup and decisions you make throughout the game. In many cases, what you block with, what you damage you take, what on hits you take, and so on and so forth will determine a lot of factors throughout the end of the game. Even as simple as something like, do you utilize Seek and Destroy over Lace with Inertia at a specific point in time to get rid of their D-React and either send it to grave or make it a brick in hand off of a Dreadbore that you have. So it really just depends. Another thing that you really have to consider is what cards are important in individual matchups. A really big example is Battering Bolt whenever the Mystic Heroes were legal. When you got to the end game, Battering Bolt basically said, I understand that you have only chi in your deck, but you have enough life. Does not matter. You have to block this or you literally lose your entire hand. Because a lot of times they would have at the end of the game D-Reacts or chi left in their deck. And sometimes they would try to set up one of the, and I forget what the card's called, Cosmic Awakening. Sometimes they'll try to set that up in Arsenal and try to throw it for, the 20. That was a lot of their end game plan. So if you send this Battering Bolt, it literally says they don't get to keep that hand, they don't get to do that play, and those chi leave the deck unless they use them on the hero ability, which usually doesn't give them anything in return. So just remember those cards in each matchup that is relevant and try to shuffle them back. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. You need to mitigate your opponent's value on every card that they play. So that could be as simple as just reducing it through stuff like frailties. Or it could come in the form of Plan for the Worst and Seek and Destroy, where you see that they have a D-React and you try to plan around in such a way that they can discard it. They can also just not fully convert their hand. So, for example, if you get a Collapsing Trap off of Plan for the Worst and Arsenal it, a lot of times people are just going to try to play around Collapsing Trap and therefore just throw something like a non-go again attack and then end up still losing your card. So you keep that Collapsing Trap in Arsenal and you just block with a little bit of cards from hand, and then if you have like a E-Strike, then you send E-Strike, pass, you still have Collapsing Trap. Now they still have to play around in another turn. That's just one of the ways that you can extract a huge amount of value off the cards, even just like the Katu concept of the arms, where you just go, hey, if you don't block this for 1 over, I'm going to pop it and then hit. And you don't want that, right? So it's just pressure that you constantly give. Some concepts like that are really important to try to navigate around. And it can also be as really just bare bones as blocking correctly. Sometimes just blocking and denying on hits like a Boom Grenade can be super relevant because you get to deny them value on their cards and therefore getting more value per your cards. Because in the example of, let's just simplicity's sake, let's just say they send a 2 for 6, they have a Boom Grenade, no go again, or they have go again, but they're probably just sending the weapon attack. And you go, okay, here's 2 cards. each of those 2 cards essentially blocked for 5 with that Boom Grenade on the field. Sometimes that's just the correct decision. Or, something like Buzzsaw Trap value, which we've all had those games. Those are really fun. And even like pulping, being able to deny them a extended turn, which has happened more than once. Just look for those opportunities that you can deny huge amounts of value, which is one of the things that Riptide excels at. Also, anti-D-React cards can potentially lead to your opponent blocking with, I guess the term is real cards, where their density of threats in their deck goes down as a result. And also these D-Reacts, if they're unable to put them back in, or put them into their arsenal, and let's say they have a CNC in arsenal and they end up having to pitch them or pitch it in like a tunic, yeah, they get to send that CNC, but they still get to keep those D-Reacts in the deck, which means later in the game that can potentially brick them and cause them to lose. That's why Dreadbore is so strong. So anti-D-React effects can actually help in those types of situations to force them to have a inefficient turn cycle. Kind of the same thing with Dominate and Overpower, where it just kind of denies them from getting full value in their hand and allowing on hits to hit, which extracts more value. The knowing what your opponent has for their win cons is incredibly important as well. So for example, with CNC and Pummel, if say Victor is stacking those and you notice that, then you try to go, okay, well, I don't want to get stuck with a bunch of traps in hand. We've all had that happen. And so therefore you try to use them a little bit more aggressively throughout the game the moment that you notice this, because you don't want to get stuck with those late in the game and get got by a pummel. On the opposite end, if you see they're doing a lot of dominate overpower stuff for the end of the game and knowing that that's probably how they're going to try to win, then try to keep your traps, because they're a little bit better overall at the end of the game. It's not as if you just always try to keep traps over attacks, but you kind of think about it a little bit and try to make decisions. Even 1 or 2 decisions can make or break a game cycle. On the opposite end, you want to get as much value per card that you can. In many cases, you try to block with your traps over the real cards in your deck to keep threats. And you try to get as much value from pings or effects like Frailty as you can. It's pretty straightforward. You're just trying to extract every bit of value. We talked about it in episode 5 whenever we were talking about the value per card and how to extract that. So you're really wanting to do that. And pretty much every cycle, you're just trying to understand where the value comes from, which is a little bit of a concept a lot of new players still don't quite get. But you got to do that math pretty much every turn. And remember that your life is also still a resource. This is a concept that we've pretty much learned in Magic. Your life is a resource that lets you utilize it to gain advantage, push tempo, keep an arsenal, or just keep threats in deck. Sometimes it's just not worth blocking that 3 if you know that, for example, they don't have reactions or they don't have stuff like Dominate or Overpower. However, you need to find a fine balance between this and understanding your opponent's deck. Like I said, you got to use caution on it. You have to understand, can I do this? Or do I need to keep a life total? Really big examples like against Brute, where you need to always keep yourself above 3 so that you don't get reckless swing killed. Try to use your lower impact cards early. This kind of applies with attacking and defending. If you're going to attack or defend with a card early game and it doesn't influence your tempo, as in you're probably going to get blocked out anyways, you're wanting to send, we'll say, Murkmire Grappler in the non-damage prevention type matchups. Sending it or blocking with it early means that it has the lowest impact on the game state throughout the entire game, so that you get to keep the cards that potentially give you more value later in the game. Say an example is with that Murkmire, you have a Lace with Bloodrot. That's still a good card, and you're going to use it anyways, but because you put it on Murkmire, you're still probably going to get a piece of armor, at least for the 1 block and 2 cards in hand. So you're able to make room for potentially better on-hits late game, so like a Searing that ends up giving you more value than the Murkmire on hit, and doesn't matter what it's paired with, but in general, the card has a better density as an attack. Getting a copy of certain cards in deck or in the grave is also kind of relevant. Codex lines, if you look at episode 4, can potentially get you really good value through your turn cycle. If you're able to predict that they have an arsenal, you know they can't get value out of it, or you know that they're going to block out anyways, or situations like that, the Codex are good. You can still block with that card in hand that you planned on attacking with anyways, if you have a Codex in hand, so that you get 3 block of value and still come in for the same attack, but also still get an arsenal. So just be aware of those kind of lines that you can extract extra value out of your card that doesn't really change your play pattern. And it doesn't really have a cost associated with doing it because you play the same way. It's just also Codex is not a great arsenal target, so in that kind of situation, if you don't have the bolt shot in graveyard, then this is just the better play. Circumstance. Continuing on, you need to make sure you use your defensive tools really well. Know when to use them, know when to hold them, know when to get max value. An example being is Calming Breeze, and Fatigue would use it a lot. Example being against Syndra, we would utilize it in such a way that we would say on the second attack, if it was a 4, we would block 3 and Calming Breeze before the reactions could happen, so that it would still block that 4, and it would block any potential instances of flick that would occur to extend the chain. So it would basically turn off their chain for the rest of that turn. And Fatigue, that was really relevant because also breakpoints was a little bit hard to deal with sometimes. Also, if you utilize it in such a way to get rid of, say, the blue flick card that draws you a card, it's insane because it gets you so much value because it denies them value. You trade card for card, but your card's still better because you get extra value out of it still throughout the game, or the rest of that turn. Another thing that you should be aware of is, depending on the situation, using the bow to send a 0-cost 4 for 5 instead of loading on a buff is potentially more relevant. Let's say you sniff out that there's a D-react in Arsenal, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to get 2 cards for this regardless. They're either going to give me armor, which is also fine, or they're going to give me that card in Arsenal and a card in hand and overblock. So sometimes just like sniffing out that 5 is the same as 7 is pretty relevant. And sometimes that +1 off of Dreadbore is better than sending even just a 1 for 5. We'll ignore Remorseless in this scenario, but that value is basically the same as a result, and you still get to keep the 1 for 5 in deck, which is a little bit higher density in deck. These little small plays can make or break, especially in matchups where they have a lot of cards in their deck that are 2 blocks. You get more value out of that 1 for 5 that turns into 6 than a 0 for 4 that turns into 5 later in the game. It's all circumstantial, which is why I really encourage you to come back and like look at these and then learn, adjust, because it's a concept that's just going to completely keep developing on itself as you learn more and more. Don't be afraid to hit breakpoints by pitching a card for bow and coming off of Arsenal, like we said. Keeping pressure in to take armor or take extra cards in hand can mean more in the long run than just, keeping that card in Arsenal. You don't always need a card in Arsenal. And one of the big concepts that I would like to talk about is New Horizons and the block value you get with it. If you're able to prevent an on-hit and you still have a trap in Arsenal, you're able to utilize it and gain value. Let's say, for example, the Boom Grenade example again. If you're able to block 5 with a trap in Arsenal and then that card, and you're able to effectively block and turn off the Boom Grenade, you extract a huge amount of extra value out of that New Horizons. But people tend to block with it early or value it too much to block with it. Basically, with New Horizons, you're always trying to look for a situation where you've already extracted value out of the card, and now you're in a situation where you can block with it, gain value because you block and prevent an on-hit, and as a result of blocking with it, you don't lose an arsenal and lose value off of it, because otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose. So you're trying to block in a situation that you can utilize your arsenal, or you don't have an arsenal, and get value off of it. And then you just wash your hands, be like, cool, we got it. So don't overvalue it, but also value it more than just randomly throwing it in front of something. Like I said, keeping the pressure. If the Dreadbore +1 buff, like I said up here, would get the same blocks as the buffed arrow, usually you try to keep the buff in deck or keep the other card in deck, because if they're going to block with 2 cards, they're still going to block with 2 cards. Whenever you have yellow Bolt and Shot, and that's really the only card that you're sending, That's one time where I think maybe it's better to send the 1 for 5 than it would be the Bolton shot, and then like try to do some fancy play with it. It really, again, depends all on the circumstance, which is why you gotta get revs. Use cards like E-Strike and Rabble early on if you're on Dreadbort, because you want to deny the opponent the ability to utilize their D-Reacts in an effective way. And when you attack with those, they can utilize them in an effective way. So you try to either, these are cards that you tend to prioritize blocking with in those matchups, or like if you need to, or to try to use them as early as humanly possible, so that you can kind of soul read and hope and pray that they don't have any D-Reacts in hand, and then therefore go, okay, cool, I got value out of this without them getting value out of their cards. So just be aware of those, keep track of the D-Reacts, know when it's a good time to use E-Strike, when it's a bad time to use E-Strike, and so on and so forth. In the case of Sea Lace, you can try to run or attack with blues that kind of encourage blocking more. So Widowmaker Blue is a prime example of this, where we are able to now utilize it in such a good way that it becomes a 1 for 5 go again off of Sea Lace, and then for them to reduce that damage, they still have to give you 2 real cards. So in matchups that don't really have a bunch of Battle Worn, or they have the consumable Battle Worn, eventually you can get to a situation where they have to give you 2 real cards. And at the end of the day, it's still 1 for 3, so it's still about the same rate as normal things, but also no D-Reacts means that it's a little bit harder to block sometimes. So by trading like a blue for potentially a red or more valuable card overall, you can end up having a better trade for the end game, which is some of the benefits of Sea Lace. Also keep in mind that your deck's damage value and health, or like the number of cards you have in the deck, always keep that in mind. It's really important to know whenever you are able to block, you can afford extra cards, or when you need to prioritize certain cards. So if you already have a Endless Arrow in Graveyard, you might value that card in your hand a little bit more in these long matchups, so that you can try to force them to block, as opposed to, say, a Drill Shot. Or in the opposite end, Drill Shot becomes worse because they're pretty much almost out of armor anyways, and you don't really want to throw a counter on, we'll say, Savage Sash for Brute. You don't really want to throw a counter on it because the second counter doesn't really matter. They're just going to pop it. Understand when and keep track when the value of a card or the health of the deck influences what cards you can block or utilize. A little awkward, and it takes a lot of understanding and matchup knowledge, but you'll get there eventually. Trench and Codex. This is pretty straightforward. You're always using your Trench to save a card in deck. If a CNC or Arsenal hate is sent to you, you're always going to use it. You're always going to use it whenever you play Trench or whenever you play Codex, so that you can keep that card from being discarded to Codex Frailty. Even if you're not really sending a 0 or a 1 for 5, you're still utilizing it so that you keep it in deck. I've had that happen a couple times. One of the play patterns you can utilize is if you literally cannot use a card, or there's a circumstance that, say, you have Trench, but you still need to get rid of this card in hand, but you need to get rid of the card in your arsenals to be able to actually play the Codex. I've actually activated Bow and in response Trenched, so that I get to keep that card in deck. It's happened more than once, and it's a really interesting and funny play. You've probably seen it on stream. So just be aware that you need to make sure you deny losing value to Codex of Frailty off of the discard. And since the game will go long, make sure you pick your Codex plays, like in those type of games, because you do not want to get your opponent free value. The amount of times I've seen someone play a Codex and give a felling to a Florian is insane. You never want to do that unless you're saying, oh, okay, cool, I'm going to get a CNC off of it, and then boom, you can't block it, so therefore I'm going to get value because I just kill it anyways. Or if you're pretty sure that they have a similar copy of the card in hand and they're going to send it anyways, you can just basically get them 1 less value off of the Frailty. You can always pitch them and use them later, so just be aware of when you play it, and when you have an arsenal or you're unable to play wide, you can still pitch it. So just be aware of when you use it, And like I said, it's fine to give them a card for a card if that means that they can't play it or you get free damage in. If they have to discard, for example. Just be careful, especially against Guardian, because giving them a Macho or giving a Victor Golden Sun is like usually worse value for you in the long run of things. Endless effects, these are pretty straightforward. You're always wanting to get your value off your endless arrows and salvage shots whenever you can. Say, for example, Rain Razor value that you get, even if it's just 2, being able to Rain Razors and keep an endless arrows is usually better in the long run of things, depending on the matchup, of course. Sometimes you can set up big plays with Rain Razors, but in the case of not like super long games, but like games that can so kind of go to Fatigue Warrior, getting those endless arrow value is usually better. Salvage Shot is kind of an extension to that, but it goes to the bottom, so you kind of get a little bit more of a deck health value. But they're really important for the way that Ranger wants to deal with fatigue, because just being able to recycle attacks. People tend to undervalue them or not value it as much when they think that that one card isn't going to matter. But a lot of times, I've literally had it to where that one endless wins you the game because they can't block it at the end of the game. You need to try to keep as many in deck as possible in these type of matchups, because the more you have, the better your end game health is, the more likely you're able to navigate through that end game. Your Quiver or Remembrance targets really depend on the matchup, but here's some really basic rules that you can follow that should be able to get you there. Try and at least get one endless or salvage shot for the most part. In most matchups, it's usually pretty good, but you always want to make sure you target your power cards for the specific matchups first. For example, with Quiver, you're only getting one each, so usually you target like an endless, the power card, and if you don't have an additional third target, you usually end up trying to get stuff that has good density. So like Remorseless versus D-React heavy decks, or just other 1-for-5s or 2-for-6s to provide the highest damage density, so that you have as much value per card as possible. And in the case of Remembrance, sometimes that actually includes shuffling back your anti-D-React cards. I've actually, on many occasions, shuffled back a Release Attention, like as well as Endless Arrows and like the power card, just because I was like, well, I think that they still have plenty of D-Reacts in deck, and I really want to make sure that they do not get their value off of those cards, so I'm going to shuffle back a buff. And that can make or break, honestly, a lot of the games. But like I said, this concept is really hard to navigate. It's really hard to put in the words, and this is like the best that we could realistically do without getting into like really specifics with like specific matchups, which end up being outdated. So if you ever have any questions on this, you can always just ask them in the Discords, and we can try to help you for those specific matchups, because there's always evolve over time. But I appreciate staying with us to talk about this concept, and despite the boring nature that this one is, and I know it's a wall of text, but at the end of the day, I have to put it that way, so that way I can get through these as fast as possible, and keep it as dense for people to be able to go back and like look at these concepts really quickly.